Good morning, everyone, and welcome to today's jointly hosted webinar by myself, Samantha Manning of Searches UK. And today we're kindly joined by Neil Wood of Future Climate Info. Can I just double check that everyone can hear me? If you can, please do use the chat or the questions tab and just let me know that you can hear me loud and clear. That would be great. We would also like to make you aware that this session is being recorded. So if you would like a copy of the recording, please do take note of that. We will be sending it out after today's webinar. For now, what I'll do is hand over to Neil, and I hope you enjoy the webinar.
Good stuff. Good morning, everyone. Hope you're well. My name is Neil Wood, Senior Business Development Manager with FCI. And for those of you who haven't come across FCI before, it stands for Future Climate Info. Been in operation since 2014 now, so 8 years old. We're in the environmental space, as you're probably aware, and so you're probably comfortable with the likes of Landmark and Groundshaw already in the space. And we do a couple of reports which I'm going to go through today as part of the education. So thanks very much to Sam at Searches UK for allowing me to present today. And so we're going to go through a few slides, case studies, reports, and just to really how to overcome further actions and how to communicate them better with your clients as much as possible. But first of all, something that I wanted to advertise to you is Searches UK are hosting seminars across the country. We've done 3 already in Leeds, Birmingham and Bristol. And what we're doing is London, Manchester and Nottingham in the spring. So we're starting off on the 22nd of March in London again. They're very well attended events, hosted by Searches UK with the Land Registry, myself, and FCI, and then you've got Stuart Title as well joining us. So if you can get to one of the locations across the country with Manchester and Nottingham to follow, then it'll be great to see you there. So in terms of what we're going to cover today, we're going to have a look at how we look at environmental commercial risks ahead of any acquisition. We're going to have a look at the approach to any due diligence. We're going to look at what reports are actually available for you and which ones to choose. We're going to have a look at a new commercial report that you may not have come across before. We're going to learn how to communicate further actions and what to look out for and why not to be petrified about them. Case study examples, and we've got some news items that we've picked from the press to go through. So ultimately, why do we do environmental reports at all? Well, we've got the Law Society that stipulates that it's best practice to do contaminated land on flood on every transaction. It's not mandatory, but it's strongly recommended because none of us want to end up in court for the sake of a couple of £100 when we could have definitively told our clients whether it's contaminated or their plot of land or premises are susceptible to flooding. We can tell most people pretty definitively these days if they've got a potential risk or not and how to overcome it. So it's all in the communication. We're the experts and we're hoping that our reports communicate those risks clearly to your client so that they can pick the report up and read it quite clearly without you having to really do a lot of interpretive work yourself, which is not really designed for. We're the environmental experts assisting you and your clients through the transaction. And with commercial, as we know, every property is unique and your next door neighbours could be quite honestly anybody. And this is a great example. This is all up in Salford, near Manchester or part of Manchester. And this is Media City, so where we did BBC do a lot of the presentations and shows. And you can see there what is surrounding this particular development. So you've got everything from docks and gasworks and warehousing, office block buildings. So you've got all sorts of different risk rankings that are attributed to all of those different use classes. So it could well be that the area and plot of land that you've got a transaction on is absolutely fine. It's been redeveloped. The chances of contamination might be low, but we don't know who your next door neighbours are. And until you do that environmental report where you put the polygon on the site itself, that is when our reports and our manual assessments come into play, because we have a look at those gasworks to the north of the picture and we'll see whether we think that's a potential contaminated use class. And if it is, we have to have a look at the potential leaching of those potential contaminants through the soils, through the air, carried by watercourses onto your land and property that you're looking to purchase, and see whether it would actually affect it in terms of contamination. And if it doesn't, you'll get a pass. And if it does, you'll get a further action. It's that simple, really. Further action doesn't mean fail. It just means we cannot tell from a desktop report point of view whether we can pass it or not. There's some unknowns that we need your help in clearing. And that's what it means effectively. Further action just means, can you give us a bit more information? And to get our initial appraisal done for the report itself, we rely heavily on our mapping. And we go back to 1843, and we typically overlay historical maps onto modern day maps to work out what the use classes have been over the course of time and all the redevelopment work that's gone on over time. So this example is a centre of Birmingham. So we've got a modern day map on the left hand side, and we've got a historical map on the right hand side. And they took a great deal of pride doing their mapping back in the 1800s, and they were really clear with what type of works were present. So whether it's a stained glass works, a pyramid works, gas works, garages, all clearly labelled, and they'll come with different risk classes. Because obviously, if you're looking at a utensils works, that might carry far less risk than a garage. And a garage will have had things like solvents, oils, petrols on site. We don't know how they were stored historically. They could have been tipped over accidentally or on purpose into drains and watercourses and soils. And that ultimately will cause contamination further down the line. And unless we've got remediation action from the local authority to say, yeah, that garage was successfully remediated, that could potentially be a further action. Whereas if you look on the right-hand side, you've got banks over there. And banks typically, as we know, won't cause contamination. So therefore, you should get a pass very, very easily on a transaction of that type. But obviously moving towards the garages, they are a big unknown. So we have to flag them accordingly. Now, contaminated land, we have got 225,000 potentially contaminated sites in this country, in the United Kingdom. And that's why environmental reports aren't going anywhere, because there's so many sites that need overturning and making free from contaminants. So we've got everything from like arsenic, nickel, mercury, asbestos, all sorts of impurities in the soil that we just don't want there, because if we're starting to build on it, we don't want children picking worms out of the soil and eating that, which could be potentially contaminated. That's the sort of thing they do. Or if you're growing vegetables, you don't want those growing in contaminated soils. And if you've got industrial uses, you don't want people walking on the commercial property, certainly like warehouses and schools and things like that, knowing there's potentially contamination underneath. And we've only got 5% of those contaminated sites that have been brought to the attention of the local authorities at this point. So we've got several generations of clear up to do, which is not unsurprising really with the big industrial past that we've had. And when we look for contaminated land uses, these are the sort of things that our products evaluate. We look at all these sort of classes on the left hand side: petrol stations, radon, gas, infilled land, landfills, telecommunication transmitters, all these sort of things that would cause issues and the quiet enjoyment of a commercial property once somebody's moved into it. Obviously, things like petrol stations are important. You've probably seen a million petrol stations that are now car washes and wondered why on earth that's the case when everything else has been developed in and around it. And the reason is that underneath a petrol station, you've got the huge storage tanks, which over time, with vehicles moving over the top, tend to move, shift and crack, and ultimately can leach into the soil underneath. And it'll leach for several meters deep, all those petrols and diesels. And when developers come to a site, they want to build, get their profits and move quickly. And when they see a petrol station, I think it's something ridiculous, like 40 to 50% of them will have a leakage at some point. So therefore, a developer would have to dig so many more meters further down than he would do ordinarily, which eats into his profit margin and could have untold amounts of issues that he'd have to deal with that they tend to leave them. So if you come across a petrol station randomly in the countryside and think, yeah, wouldn't that be nice to have a property on? And the major reason is because developers don't want to touch them because they won't make much profit, if at all, on those sites. This is a case study example. This is in Sunderland, if anybody knows it. So it's a street called Homeside. So this is a modern day map that we're looking at now, just off the city centre. And as we overlay one of those historical maps, which I showed you before, you can start to see what the use classes were. So you can see we've got a cinema and a print works and a depot and a theatre and all sorts of things. But what I've circled there is a garage. And obviously the same principles apply to this one as did the previous one, where you've got solvents, oils, and all sorts of things that have been on site, maybe tipped over and into the watercourses. So what's happened over time, as you can see, if I go back to the previous slide, is doesn't seem to be anything there, which again is not too unsurprising. So I had a little look on Google just to see what it was and what it is. So the picture on the left hand side is what it was, which is Turvey's garage, and you can see that's the turn of the last century, and it was very much operational and very much part of the hub of the town. And on the right hand side is what you can see it looks like today. So unfortunately they're looking at a picture of Lawrence Llewellyn Bowen, unfortunately, but there's nothing there. So they've converted that building on the left to Sinatra's, which I think is a restaurant or a coffee shop, and on the right hand side, which looks to be almost a car park and derelict land behind the poster. And so I went on Google Earth just to have a look in a bit more detail, and you can see that is exactly what it is. So it could well be that developers investigated this and thought, you know what, I think there's potentially contamination there, and that's why certain contaminated plots are left as car parks. So if you go into city centres and sometimes there's big car parks and you think, oh, that would be prime for development. Sometimes the previous use class that was on site could have contaminated it to such a degree that a developer doesn't want to do investigation work because it could cost an absolute fortune or eat into his profit margin, as we mentioned before. So they tend to be left as car parks, basically just not putting a spade in the ground because that could cause the linkage between the contamination and the surface, whether that's a watercourse or people. We don't want that. Other things we do when we look at environmental reports is we'll go on Google Earth, we'll have a look around the property, we'll see if we can see any evidence of the way materials are stored. So in this example, you can see behind the red lorry there, you've got some petrol and diesel pumps, and we know a lot about those now because we've talked about them. Underneath that concrete slab floor, there's going to be big containers of petrols and diesels, which may have moved, shifted and cracked over the course of time and caused contamination. So you may well get a further action on that property, and it will be because of those fuel tanks. So it's a bit of common sense, really, and unless we know there's evidence that those tanks have been remediated successfully, it may well stay a further action. And if you ever get a site overview or a site walkover, you can see this is an actual photograph or a couple of photographs of when that happened. People store their materials in incorrect ways. So you might have oil drums and oil cylinders, like in this case, and they're thrown into some sort of holdall, and they could literally spill over and go into the drains. So they were given a remediation order, and they had to tidy up their storage facilities in order for the acquisition to go through, and they did successfully. In terms of case studies, as you can appreciate, with contaminated land, there's never a million hitting the news at any one time. You're not going to turn the 6 o'clock news on and have a contaminated land story to look at. There's plenty of flood stories, as we know, and we'll go across that shortly. But this is one in Scotland, featured in the Daily Record. It's Castle Douglas Golf Club. And they found contamination in a plot of land that was next to the golf club that they acquired, and they were putting a driving range onto it. And it turned out that the plot was contaminated, and there was a £500,000 bill to remediate the land, which at the time the local authority, the local council, found the money, and a court order actually said that it's not the responsibility of the local authority to pay for it, it's actually Castle Douglas Golf Club. So as you can imagine, the local authority paid that money pretty swiftly back into their own accounts, and Castle Douglas Golf Club have still got the £500,000 remedial action on this land. And to my knowledge, as much as I keep Googling it, I can't find a resolution to this. So maybe they haven't done anything at all, because many golf courses or many businesses don't have £500,000. So unfortunately, I think it's been a case of they can't go near the land or use it, as far as I'm aware. And I found this story on the right-hand side. Maybe it's linked, maybe it isn't, but it was at Castle Douglas again. And a woman having a walk has found that there's piles of dead and decaying fish near a drain, and it's pretty unsure as to how that's happened, but there's contamination coming from somewhere into those watercourses. And these are the sort of evidence that we tend to find in the news, and it's attributed to contaminated land somewhere, or someone tipping something into drains, or maybe historically, and it's just killing things. So these are the sort of news stories that could be linked, and things we need to remediate quite successfully in order that people can build successfully on top. And our reports, very much traffic light led. We end up with 3 outcomes typically, and I'm going to show you all 3. Pass is the green tick that we're all hoping to get, which allows our clients to move. Further action is the one we tend to try and avoid. It just means that we need further information. It's not a fail. It just might mean that we can see it used to be a garage or a gasworks, and we haven't got anything in terms of evidence that we can overturn this decision to a pass. So we're going to ask you to contact the local authority, speak to the building control or the planning teams or the environmental health contaminated land officer, if there is one, and see if they've got any evidence that this land was remediated successfully, and will happily overturn your reports from further action back to a pass the very same day. Failing that, there's obviously insurance and indemnities that you can get hold of. In the world of contaminated land, everything is pretty much a subjective risk. There might be contamination there, there might not. And because it's a subjective risk, you'll always be able to get insurance for that. Whereas flood, it's very much a black and white issue. You're either going to flood or you're not. And so therefore, the type of insurances you can get differs, and that is why. One's subjective and one isn't. And then we end up with sort of an amber warning here, which is pass with considerations. The pass element is for you, means that the property or plot of land is absolutely fine. But the considerations is something that's just outside of the scope of the property that may hinder the quiet enjoyment of that acquisition. So it could well be that the warehouse that they're looking to buy is absolutely fine, but the roundabout on the corner floods continuously, so they wouldn't get the heavy goods vehicles through. So that would be a consideration. Would you want to locate your business near a junction that constantly floods and could really impact your business? And it could also be that you're near an electricity substation, and some people don't want their staff to work near electromagnetic fields. So it's a consideration. So just look out for those in the reports. I'll show you one shortly as well. And our entry level for our commercial reports is 15 hectares, which is quite a considerable size. And you can see this is a picture overhead of Brighton and the pier. So it gives you an idea. There's a good few blocks of properties there that fit comfortably within 15 hectares. So you can get a good picture yourself of all the transactions you would typically do. And I would say most will fall into that banding. If it is maybe a plot of land or a farm or something like that, then you may be going to get a bigger site than 15 hectares, especially if it's going to be for maybe a new build development plot. So here's some examples of pass and pass with considerations on screen. So we've got a pass, makes life very easy. We do something called exception reporting at FCI, which means that we only put in the risks that are intrinsic to the property. If we've looked through all the data sets and found that most of them aren't applicable, we will extract those out of the report so the report concertinas and becomes smaller. So you're not having to read lots of empty paragraphs about things that don't exist. So if the property doesn't flood, we're not going to give you lots of maps showing you where the nearest brooks, rivers and streams are, because your client's not interested. So therefore we take those out, it shrinks the report and makes it a lot easier for you to read, a lot easier for your client to read. And historically, when FCI came into the market, this was quite new and something people weren't comfortable with, because they were used to paying £200 or £300 for a report and getting half an inch worth of paper. We changed that by taking away all the irrelevant information and ended up with a report of about 15, 20 pages. So people thought we were missing information, when in actual fact we just took away all the information you just didn't need to read in the first place. So it's become very, very popular because of that. And obviously the lion's share of our work is a lot of paperwork and a lot of reading, making sure our clients' risks are catered for. So this is what we look to do with an FCI report. We've got the examples on screen as well of that, because you go from section 1.02 to 1.04. So you're probably thinking, where's 1.03? And that has been taken out of the report because it just wasn't found. There's nothing there. We put all of the collective data sets that we haven't found into a summary table for you. So you know that we've looked for it, but we just didn't find anything, and I'll show you that. Section 1.04, we've got potentially contaminated current land uses, so it's a pass with considerations here. And what we're showing you in that category at the bottom is what we've found. So it's a servicing garage, which is manufacturing, engineering, maintenance and storage. So there could have been solvents and diesels and petrols on site, as we've mentioned before. So we've got to flag these things if we think it's a risk. If it's close enough to your property or on or underneath the property, it could well be a further action instead. And check data sets is the section I've just been referring to, where all the sections that we don't give you a full section of text on and supporting information, we'll extract it, and then we'll give you a summary at the end of every section to say, we've looked for all these things, but we haven't found them. So we've looked for petrol stations, we've looked for historical landfill, but there weren't anything present. So you can report back to your client, this is what we looked for, we haven't found anything. The only thing you need to be concerned about is this pass with considerations, which refers to XYZ at close proximity to the site. So we've got old Macaulay Culkin here, frightened to death about further actions. So I want to make sure that you're not frightened as well when you come into contact with them. And our environmental report for FCI Commercial is on the screen. So you can see now we've got the environmental section at the top, your contaminated land. We've colour coded it, so you've got your flood in blue, your ground stability, energy and infrastructure all included. So it's everything from wind farms, solar farms, nuclear power stations, fracking sites, things like that all included, HS2, Crossrail, all those sorts of things. Ground stability, telling you what type of soil structure and rock structure lies beneath. It's very rare you're going to get a further action in the bottom two sections because they are very subjective risks. We're not going out doing an actual survey of the property, so we don't know if there's any cracks in it, for example. You need a proper site survey for that. All we're going to tell you is you've got maybe a clay soil that are prone to shrink and swell. So in summer, all the water will be extracted from the soils and it could crack it and shrink it. And in the winter like this, where we get heavy rainfall for a sustained period of time, it will expand that soil. And the expansion and shrinking of those soils can cause subsidence claims. In 2018, when we had the heat waves, and we had the most subsidence claims in over a decade in this country because of that. So watch out for the text in the ground stability section. It does equate to things like trees as well. So you may well have some clients who've got car parks and they've got trees in the car park, for example. So if they've got clay soils, those trees are going to try and extract all that moisture out of the soils as well. So that is factored in. So as we can see off this front sheet, it's telling you and your client, look, we've got two further actions in this case, both in the worst case scenarios, which is in flood and contaminated land circumstances. And we're telling you on the front which next steps to look at. I've blown that up on the right hand side for you, so you can see which sections we need to thumb through to very quickly, just to get that specialist advice and understand what to do next. So further action in this case, we've found petrol filling stations, and we're all now experts on petrol filling stations, and we know why that's been flagged up. So that is pretty much on site or adjacent to this site, 0 meters away, and also a builder's yard, which is on or right next to this site as well. So we don't know what was stored on that builder's yard unless the local authority can advise and inform you of that. And you can get the further action. And all we're asking you to do is go back to that local authority, as we've said on the text, under the next steps, get the relevant records and see if we can overturn it via all those local authority sections back to a pass if they're happy and comfortable with it. If they're not, if they're really not sure what is buried there, or they're not sure if the petrol station has leaked, then you can always get an indemnity from your usual supplier. And as it also says on there, there's something called an FCI appraisal report for a fixed fee. And that is if you don't have the time to be able to do all the investigative work, we will do it for you. And there is a charge for that, but we will contact things like the Environment Agency, the local authority, protection authorities, could be fire service and all sorts of people, just to get a rounded conclusion to this property for you. So if your client wants that fully investigated by us, we will happily do that for you. And these are the sort of 3 follow-on services. The one I've just mentioned is in the middle there. And the one on the left-hand side is the review that I've mentioned to you, that if you get further action, collect all that auxiliary information from the local authority, and it does overturn it. our review team will look at it, evaluate it, turn the further action back to a pass within 48 hours and revert it back to a pass for free. The middle option is the appraisal, so if you don't have the time and inclination to do it yourself, for any reason, we will happily do it for you, speaking to those regulatory bodies and environmental information bodies as well. It could take up to 20 working days, and the prices are on screen, which just been made available. And on the right-hand side is something called an FCI walkover, and that is where we mentioned those oil drums, if you remember, and how they were storing them previously on that photograph. This is where you may get a further action, and it may be prudent to have an expert walk around the site just to see who the neighbours are, if they're storing their materials correctly, if the site in question being acquired has been storing their materials correctly, if there's any evidential sites of contamination being exposed. Is your client downstream or upstream of the neighbour? Because obviously contamination is going to flow downhill. It's going to be washed through the soils or carried on streams and things like that. So it may well reduce your premiums for indemnity cover by having a site walkover. So they're about £1,000 to £1,500 typically, depending on the size of the site, but that could reduce the insurance indemnities that your client has to pay for substantially as a result of having one. So they do have their merits. If you want to use them, please do so. So this is an example of the FCI appraisal that I've just mentioned. These are the people that we would contact on your behalf, or you can do it yourself, obviously. The environmental health team, and we'll tell you who we spoke to, what their role and responsibilities are, when we spoke to them, and what they said in relation to the site, and we'll document that in the report. And similarly, we've done that with the Petroleum Enforcement Authority and the Environment Agency as well. And in a case like this, we may evaluate all of that, plus our mapping, plus our original analysis, and we may come back and turn the further action into a pass and give you the professional opinion summary on the front. So this will advise you who's done the assessment, it's signed on the front, and it will tell you how we came to our conclusion, and so your client can move with confidence. Like I said before, if you get any evidence of any sort, whether it's a residential transaction or commercial, it's both the same. We'll happily take a letterheaded paper or an email with an official signature on it. Email that into our team, which is fci-admin@didurham.com, and we will happily overturn where we possibly can. Now, we've gone from contamination into a flood scenario, so I'm going to help picture this for you. So we've got the surface water flood risk in the example that I showed you, and this is to the north of the site. So you can see all these green pixels on screen, and those green pixels represent 5 metre squares. So maybe the size of the room that you sat in a typical office, maybe. And JBA, who put the surface water assessment together for us, work out where water moves between one square and another, then ultimately where it pools in a natural basin. So you can see there, there's a lot of pixels in and around this particular area. The denser the colour, the deeper the water. So it's affecting the north of this particular plot. Now that might be an area that's not going to be redeveloped, it's going to be a field, and it might not be a problem for your client. But if there's going to be some sort of activity on that north side, it could be a car park, or it could well actually touch on the property itself. You want to know more details, really. So we've got something called a next steps. So you can see there's something called an FCI flood appraisal there. And this is historically where you'd have had to have contacted a flood consultant to appraise a situation for you if you couldn't get suitable and affordable flood insurance. And that could have cost for a commercial property thousands of pounds. And we didn't want that to be a barrier to sale. So we've teamed up with a company called Ashfields. And Ashfields are specialist flood consultants. And this is something that you can have with any further action report. And I'll show you what that does in a couple of slides' time. But first of all, I just wanted to go into those pixels again, and just to give you a layman's terms as to what they mean. This is a classic example, and one of the biggest pieces of misinformation in the market really is you can't flood at the top of a hill. You can. You can flood at the top of a hill, halfway down the hill, pretty much anywhere. And if you think of it, this is a sloping street as an example. Where that white car is at the top, if you poured an enormous jug of water down this road, then the drains are going to fill up quite quickly, and the water's just going to run down the pavement, run down the road, and it's going to go in every nook and cranny imaginable. And on the right-hand side, you can see some purple pixels there, which is representing this basement you can see on the photograph. Because the water's just going to rush down those stairs and into that basement. It's going to go on the path of least resistance, and it's going to flood anywhere where it can do. So this is halfway up a hill, and they might be 10 miles away from the nearest river. So they might think there's absolutely no chance we can flood here, but you can. And this is trying to tell you that based on the statistical modelling of a 1 in, say, 100-year flood, this is showing you in the worst case scenario what can happen. Now, it might well be that this property is never flooded, certainly in the lifetime of the occupants. So they might say, well, I've lived here 30 years, it's never flooded. What's this report talking about? Well, this is based on 1 in 100 or 1 in 200-year flood risk event. So you'd have to be nearly 200 years old to know whether this property would effectively flood or not. It's not enough to say I've lived here 30 years, it's not going to flood, because that's just not true. It's based on the worst statistical model. And as we know, these can strike over any town at any given time. And you just need to be unlucky. Because it says 1 in 100 years, it doesn't mean it's going to happen in 100 years' time. It could happen next week, and then it could happen the year after, and then not for 150 years. So it's on a statistical likelihood, but it could happen literally tomorrow. And that's what these reports are trying to protect your client from. This is another example just to show you. Again, it's a residential example, but this is Leeds. On the right-hand side, you can see a colour-coded map. So the dark, dense red area at the top is the outskirts of Leeds on the ring road, going into the city centre in the green on the right-hand side, where all the rivers are and so on. And you'd probably think where the blue circle is, there's no chance of me flooding, it's halfway down the hill, which is about where Headingley is, if you know the cricket ground there in Leeds. And then we've got the middle picture, which is showing you a particular close, and it's a cul-de-sac where it slopes 77 metres, as you can see on the diagram at the bottom. You can do this yourself on Google Earth if you want. On any particular road, you can see the slope. And as you can see from our JBA modelling on the left-hand side, the top of the road is fine, but as you get to the bottom of that cul-de-sac, as you would imagine, it's got to level off where the properties are at the bottom, and it goes into a natural basin or swimming pool where that water wouldn't naturally collect. So you'd probably think halfway up a hill, my properties are absolutely fine, but until you see the statistical model playing out in front of you, you now know that you've got a surface water risk. And would your client typically move there if they knew that? Maybe not. And this example will paint 1,000 words. This is JBA's offices, not the sandpit, but the sandpit is in their offices. So I went over there, and it's quite a technical piece of work. It's a big sandpit, as you can see, and it's got an overhead projector connected to a high-powered computer. So you can mould the sand to whatever you like. So I represented a hill, and it puts the contours on it for you. So I stuck my thumb in the top. I put a Lego brick to represent your commercial property and simulated rainfall. And what will happen is the water will naturally collect, as you would imagine, in any natural depression. And then it'll look for the path of least resistance to get down the hill. So in our case, it could go straight through the property, down the footpath or road, overwhelming the drains. And if you're on a T-junction halfway down that hill, where's that water going? It's going to literally naturally flow over your driveway, over the grass garden, car park, into your office building, and take everything in its path with it. So if anything you remember out of today's session, it's these photographs, because it depicts clearly to your client the susceptibility of flood pretty much anywhere. And a report to help you overcome environmental matters for properties such as shops and retail, anything that you can see on here really, we've devised a special FCI retail report. So it could be for takeaways, shops, cafes, nightclubs, building societies, pubs, post offices, things like that. If you come across properties like that that you're doing transactions on, you don't need to do an FCI commercial report for it. We've mitigated the difference between some clients who are doing no transaction at all to the ones that are having to pay £200 to £300 for an FCI commercial report, and find a price point in the middle that would suit, that would contain all of the risk sets that we're looking for: contaminated land, ground stability and flood for these type of properties. Because they're built on high streets and town and city centres, most people think there shouldn't be much contamination there. So therefore, maybe we can get away with not doing one at all. That's fine, and yes, in 98% of the cases you're going to be correct. But unfortunately, as we know, retail properties flood just as easily as residential properties. And so if you're not doing an environmental report, you're not finding out whether your client's susceptible to flooding. And you don't want them knocking on your door in 6 months saying, I've flooded and now I'm out of business. And I'm sure for the sake of the transactional cost, it would have been worth it for them to do it. So those are the two reports. So we've got FCI retail, we'll look at that in a second. We've got the FCI commercial, so you can now see that there's two in the marketplace to choose from. For everything that doesn't fit into the FCI retail report, defaults into the FCI commercial. So it's quite simple to understand. So the retail goes up to 0.25 hectares, which is about a third of a football pitch or a rugby pitch, to give you an idea. We've got air quality as part of this report as well. So it's looking at the quality of air in and around the premises that you're purchasing. A company called EarthSense look for that information, and they will strap detectors to lampposts and major traffic intersections to capture particulate matter from exhaust fumes and things like that. Nitrogen dioxide monitoring, because people sometimes want to locate their business in a clear air zone. They don't want natural contamination in there. They don't want their staff working in these environments, or they don't want to locate their outdoor cafe facilities on a junction, which could potentially cause harm for people with respiratory illnesses breathing in toxic air. Very prevalent in the residential space at the moment, and we've carried that information across into the retail as well for you. And something that you may never have heard of, which we've put into this report as well, is called a remediation warranty, which you can see in the red text. This, for the first time, is a guaranteed remediation warranty in the commercial space. It's part of all of our residential reports, but as I mentioned earlier in the presentation, commercial reports tend to be bespoke insurance indemnities. This one, because it's a retail establishment, we know it's relatively low risk. We know that your next door neighbour is actually going to be another shop or another residential property. It's not going to be a gasworks. We can include something that protects your client for up to 6 years after they've purchased the property. If we've given it a pass, as you can see on screen, and it turns out within 6 years the land is contaminated, there's a funny smell or odour, or things have stopped growing, or the grass is dying, or something along those lines on the grounds, then if we can't pin the blame on the original polluter or a developer, then the remediation warranty will cover your client up to £100,000 worth of excavation costs to replenish the soils and eradicate the contamination. So that is peace of mind for your clients for the first time in any transaction in the commercial space. And to give you an idea how big 0.25 hectares is, this is a Sainsbury's on a local high street in Brighton, I think, and that's 0.15 hectares, just to give you a cost idea. When you start looking for case studies, there's quite a lot around in terms of retail shops flooding. Hebden Bridge, if you've heard of it, in Yorkshire, floods quite substantially, quite readily. They even have alarm sirens as well. And it's a big problem. It's down a big valley. There's a river that runs all the way through this area. So they get surface water and they get river flooding as well. And most of these shops don't get insurance at all anymore. So it's down to the residents to clear up the mess themselves. So I'm sure that if your client was buying a property on the street like this, they'd want to know if it flooded, especially if they'd come from out of the area. And I got this statistic from Aviva's website from last year. 1 in 3 business properties are at risk from flooding. So it's quite a substantial amount, probably more than you think. Many are unprotected from these types of risks. Just further down, actually, from Hebden Bridge is where this photograph was taken. I've been down this road many times. It's the Calder Valley. They've spent a huge amount on defences in this area, millions of pounds. I know all the properties down here do not get flood insurance because it flooded that readily. And it's only if you get flood barriers like this in place, maybe will insurers consider allowing indemnities for these types of properties. But I know that there's like a butcher's on this stretch, and every time it floods, they've got to close, they've got to remediate their property, they've got to sweep it out. And as you can see from the picture on the right, it's not pleasant. you've got to sweep it out, clean it up. And I think there's a pub in York where it floods continuously. And what they've done, they put all the power sockets down from the ceiling, and all the pipe work and so on. So if it floods up to like waist height, they can allow the water to subside, they can sweep the floors and get back into business quickly because the power sockets haven't been compromised because they're not at knee level, and all the pipe work's literally coming down from the ceiling, so they can get back to work quickly. But those are the sorts of serious measures that some of these businesses have had to take because they can't get conventional insurance anymore. And the way that the climate is moving, as we know, we're getting more substantial rainfall events as time progresses. And that is not going to change any time in the next 30 years. So clients have got to be much more aware of potential flooding and climate change. 40% of businesses do not reopen after a flood event. Okay, that is very significant. So what I mentioned to you before, if a shop floods, you don't want someone knocking on your door saying, why didn't you tell me that my shop could have flooded? Now I'm not going to get back into business, and many don't. Albeit this is an American statistic, it is applicable in this country as well. 40% is extremely high. And there was a case in Leeds, this is Kirkstall Road going out of Leeds from the city centre, flooded significantly over Christmas in 2015. No one saw it coming. Suddenly they got like a month's worth of rainfall in an hour or two, completely overwhelmed the drains and flooded all the properties on the high street. One of them was a business called Tyrannosaurus Pets, believe it or not. It was a reptile shop. They had a lot of animals in the basement, and as you can understand from any flood scenario, the basement's going to get flooded first. And a lot of properties on this road had to relocate. That's if they were fortunate enough to be able to relocate. And it cost the city an estimated £37 million for this one incident. And I literally Googled Tyrannosaurus Pets yesterday just to see how they've gone on since. And as you can see on the left-hand side on their Twitter feed, they've said they're having to close their doors finally. And that was 2018. They hope they'll be able to continue in a modified form as a result of the floods. But due to all the factors, they haven't been able to. So that's many lives ruined, their business ruined as well. All for the sake that they probably could have found out that their property could have flooded. And on the right-hand side, literally, if you just Google Tyrannosaurus Pets, I've got the permanently closed sign. And that's a really sad end to probably a very useful business. So Leeds, I thought I'd embed this video just to show you what Leeds have actually done to try and protect the clients in terms of flood defences. And they've got this new type of weir in place, the first of its kind in this country, which is starting to protect all these businesses in the centre of the city. So if I'll play this for you, you can have a look what they're doing. So a really good example of what can be done in city centres. Obviously, things like that aren't going to be cheap, but it certainly offsets the amount of damage and devastation that's going to be caused as a result of doing nothing at all. And I think the climate change projections and the flood projections, as I've mentioned before, aren't going to get much better. We're going to get wetter summers. We're going to get warmer summers as well. You've probably heard of climate change increasing temperatures on average by one degree or something. What does that mean? Well, ultimately, we're going to get more and more heat waves. So we're probably used to one every 5 years in the 90s. I think it's going to be every other year by 2050 statistically as we speak today. We'll all be on our deck chairs hopefully by then. But what that will mean, as you may well already know, is warm air can hold more moisture. And because of that, the rainfall through the summer months is going to be more prolonged and pronounced as well. So the drains have really got to be able to stand up to the test. So if we start building these flood defences now and these new modern day weird designs, it could well protect a lot of these commercial properties that we've got in towns and city centres. And it all comes down to funding, as we know, but hopefully Leeds is paving the way for us here. The last thing I'm going to pretty much finish on, I think, in the slides is the FCI flood appraisal. So this is where you get that further action for flood and don't know what to do other than maybe try and get insurance or advise your client to consult with a flood consultant. Ashfields provide this report to us. It's a specialist flood consultant report. They evaluate everything they possibly can to overturn a further action back to a pass. I think it's 85% of all our reports pass first time, so 15% don't. And out of the 15% that don't, 50% subsequently pass when they take one of these consultant reports. So they will have a look to see whether your property has got a sloping element to it, i.e. does it slope up to your front door or down to the front door? Most commercial properties have got steps up to their front door, for example, so it would suggest that the water would hit the steps, but it wouldn't flood your property. So they will give you that granular detail. They will have a look at local flood defences. So we've mentioned Leeds, for example, they would factor that in. They would see whether there's any local drainage plans from developers, if they're looking to put extra support in to help deviate water away from a certain area. They'll have a look to see whether you've got grassy areas, because obviously water will infiltrate grass first. And if they've got lakes and ponds on site, it's going to fill those first before it hits a property. They'll look at the depth of the water at any given location. So if the depth of the water is 20 centimetres and the entrance to the property is 30 centimetres, they'll maybe revise the report to a pass with considerations that, yes, the property's fine and won't flood, but your car park will flood continuously. So therefore, it's a consideration of whether you want to purchase that property for your business, knowing that your car park's going to flood. So they will do everything they possibly can to evaluate it and turn it round and give you a diagnostic check on really the reasons and causes for any particular flood. So if you're getting a first floor office, for example, you probably think, well, what do I need a flood report for? You're going to be concerned if the ground level floods or if the car park floods, then it would be a big consideration. Are you taking a lease out or purchasing a particular business on the first or second floor? And these reports are very, very successful at giving that granular detail. If anybody wants a sample of one of these, reach out to Searches UK. I'll get you a sample so you can read through a typical scenario. And the last two slides are going back to the FCI retail, just to show you where the air quality is mentioned on the front cover. And it's in the report as well, very pixelated. Areas such as London are going to be more susceptible to contamination in terms of air quality and air pollution. But as we know, a lot of people have been relocating properties and businesses out of major city centres, and air quality may well come into it, especially like we mentioned before, outdoor seating areas with bars and restaurants. Everyone wants quiet enjoyment of their new acquisitions. So thank you very much. I know there's a lot of material in there, but hopefully you can watch it back. Some good case studies to look back on. Remember one or two of those photographs when you're communicating with your clients, and hopefully you can rely on an FCI report to do that. You can contact me on the email address you can see on the screen if anything triggers an issue for you, or something that you've remembered, or something you're working on at the moment you need a bit more clarity on. And our FCI admin address is on there as well, if you've got anything technical or you want to overturn further action. So thank you very much from me. Sam, is there anything else you'd like to add?
No, we haven't got any live questions at the moment, Neil. So what we'll do is anyone on the live webinar, if you have got any questions, as Neil said, you can email the FCI admin email address on the screen, or you can email us at Searches UK. So our email address is marketing@searchesuk.co.uk, and we'll be more than happy to answer any questions. All I've got to say is thank you so much to everyone for taking the time to attend. I know you're really busy, so we really do appreciate it. And we'll look forward to speaking with you again soon. Thanks so much, everyone. Take care. Bye.